I've been working as a concierge in an old residential building for about a year now. The place dates back to Victorian times when cotton mills dotted the landscape, and this building was one of many converted into flats after renovations. With the housing market spiraling out of reach for so many, it's no surprise that city centers are filled with apartments now. As for me, I ended up taking this job out of necessity. I didn't have much of a skill set, and bills needed to be paid. The people who live here are mostly professionals and students. You've got aspiring doctors, lawyers, architects, you name it. Honestly, watching them go about their important, high-powered lives sometimes gets to me. Meanwhile, here I am, sitting at the concierge desk, processing parcels and handling complaints. Most residents are polite, but there's always a handful who act entitled, like they're better than everyone else. My duties? Well, I deal with deliveries, manage the car park, report problems to the right departments, handle contractors, and keep track of keys and fob cards. It's a job, not exactly a career. My shifts alternate between days and nights, with a 4-day break in between, and there's overtime if I want it. My co-workers are decent, and overall, it's a straightforward gig. Sure, you get the occasional drunk, a loud party, or a domestic dispute, but nothing out of the ordinary. That said, night shifts, they can get a little eerie. Most of the time, I chalk it up to the creaky pipes or random tapping noises. But there's something about being awake when the rest of the world is asleep. It makes the night feel enormous, almost like it belongs to you alone. On some late nights, I've even taken a walk around, soaking in the quiet. When I first started, this older woman named Faye trained me. She showed me the ropes, like how to work the CCTV and handle meter readings. During one of our night shifts, she casually warned me to avoid the building's blind spots. She claimed the place was haunted, said it had a dark history involving poorly treated workers from the Victorian-era who died on the job. I laughed it off at first, thinking she was just trying to spook me. But then something strange happened. One night during training, Faye went to grab a coffee from the club room, which is this cozy shared lounge for residents. I got distracted and ended up dozing off, only to wake up on the 9th floor of Block B. Yep, turns out I'm a sleepwalker. I didn't want to tell management about it, so I asked if I could stick to morning shifts. No luck. We're required to rotate between mornings and nights. When I made it back to reception that night, I realized Faye never came out of the club room. I checked the CCTV footage. She walked into the kitchen, which is a blind spot on the cameras, and then, nothing. She vanished. Faye never came back, and no one seemed to know what happened to her. After that, I did my best to power through the night shifts, but things only got weirder. Weekday nights are quiet, but weekends? It's a circus. The residents are in party mode, and the phone doesn't stop ringing. One weekend, I fell asleep again. This time, I woke up in the staff room, surrounded by party decorations and with marker doodles all over my face. I was completely baffled. When I checked the cameras, I saw myself sleepwalking, residents laughing at me, taking pictures, even hugging me in the elevators. It was beyond humiliating, but I needed this job. That night was chaotic. Some of the residents were causing trouble, writing down car registrations of people they didn't like, and using the parking system to issue fake fines. I was barely holding it together, and every shift seemed to spiral further out of control. Before long, I became the star of the residents' Facebook group, the infamous sleepwalking concierge. By the time I showed up for my next shift, the looks and comments were non-stop. People kept trying to high-five me or jokingly ask, "So, you planning on sleepwalking tonight?" I tried to laugh it off and respond with a bit of humor, but the whole thing was embarrassing. To prevent it from happening again, I started locking myself in the staff room whenever I felt sleep creeping in. I figured at least I'd stay contained. Turns out, I was wrong. Somehow, I'd still manage to wander out and roam around the building. I'd wake up with random items in my pockets, clueless about where they'd come from. Luckily, most of the residents seemed to find it entertaining rather than alarming, so no one complained to management. Sometimes, my co-workers even helped out by keeping an eye on me while I wandered around in my sleep. Eventually, I decided enough was enough. I was determined to stay awake during my shifts, so I turned to energy drinks for help. I found one brand I really liked. It claimed to keep you wide awake. The first time I tried it, I didn't feel much different. No sudden burst of energy or anything. But then, almost like clockwork, chaos erupted. Maintenance issues started piling up, a flooded hallway here, a random blackout there, even shattered windows out of nowhere. Calls from residents poured in, and I was running around like a maniac trying to keep things under control. I ended up calling for backup from nearby concierges working for the same company and even had to summon the grumpy on-call engineers, who clearly hated being dragged out of bed at ridiculous hours. But the weirdness didn't stop. The next night, I drank that same energy drink again. This time, the calls I got weren't about broken pipes or lights, they were much worse. Residents were suddenly having seizures, and others were calling down to report injuries like broken bones. I had no idea what was going on. It was like the whole building was cursed, and I was frantically dialing ambulances left and right. Another night, I drank the same stuff, and the trouble escalated yet again. This time, it wasn't accidents or medical emergencies, it was theft. Cars in the parking lot were being broken into, and thieves somehow managed to sneak inside the building to steal things. I'll admit, all the madness kept me awake, but it was starting to feel like there was some strange connection between the drink and the chaos. Then one evening, while sipping the energy drink at the start of my shift, a random man stopped me. He looked concerned, almost panicked. "You shouldn't drink that," he said. "Why not? You think it'll give me a heart attack or something?" I replied, brushing him off with a line I'd heard before. "No," he said firmly, "because that brand doesn't boost your energy. It just stirs up trouble around you to keep you awake." His words hit me like a punch. My mind raced back through all the bizarre incidents, the floods, the injuries, the thefts. It all started clicking. I didn't say anything to the guy, just quietly tossed the drink in the trash. From that moment, I swore I'd never touch it again. Not long after, the managers sent out a company-wide email. It was about a string of residents who had gone missing from the building. The police were swarming the place, reviewing CCTV footage, interviewing everyone. Management was clearly more worried about unpaid rent than about the actual people who had disappeared. When the police questioned me, I mentioned that some residents had reported hearing screams before the disappearances. I didn't have much else to offer, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something much darker was going on in this building. By this point, I'd adjusted a bit to the night shifts. I wasn't sleepwalking as often anymore, but it still happened on occasion when I did doze off. Small victories, I figured. It was during one of these nights, around 3 a.m., when I wandered into the club room. In a corner of the room, the exact spot where the CCTV didn't reach, I saw something that chilled me to the core. Faye was there, or at least what was left of her. Her ghostly figure floated in the blind spot, alongside one of the missing residents. Faye had a stab wound in her chest, and the other resident was missing a hand, their body riddled with similar wounds. They didn't move, they just hovered there, staring blankly. I froze for a moment, but instinct took over, and I slowly backed out of the room, barely able to breathe. Even though I'd been getting better at staying awake during shifts, the sleepwalking hadn't stopped completely. Every so often, I'd wake up in strange places with random objects in my pockets, completely unaware of how they got there. Thankfully, the building's floors and hallways were camera blind spots, so no one saw me. But now, the ghosts were becoming a regular occurrence. I'd see them in those blind spots, always floating, always mutilated, always the missing residents. One night, I couldn't take it anymore and called another concierge to witness what I'd been seeing. He joined me, and together we stood staring at the figures in the shadows. At first, he was frozen, just like I had been, but then something drew him in. He stepped closer to the blind spot, almost as if he couldn't help himself. That's when it happened. The ghosts moved suddenly, stabbing themselves into him as if they were one with the air. He screamed, a sound that pierced through the silence of the night, and then they lifted him off the ground. In a flash, both he and the ghosts disappeared. He was gone. Just like that. I couldn't go to the managers about this. How could I? Everything was happening in the blind spots, the places the cameras didn't cover. Without proof, no one would believe me. And so, I kept quiet. More emails came in from management about missing residents and the importance of staying alert, but it felt meaningless. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal, and it wasn't something anyone could control. Then one night, I noticed a foul, rotting stench wafting through the office connected to the reception area. It was so strong, it made my stomach turn. The smell seemed to be coming from the large filing cabinet in the corner, one I'd always assumed was empty. I opened it, and my heart dropped. Inside were severed limbs, hands, feet, pieces of flesh, all wrapped in bits of blood-soaked clothing. The smell was overwhelming, but my eyes caught something else amidst the horror, my pocket knife, the one I thought I'd lost months ago. It was stained with dried blood. That knife was my favorite. I carried it everywhere, mostly for practical things like slicing bread or cutting up my meals during shifts. But there it was, sitting in the middle of this gruesome pile, unmistakably mine. My mind raced as I tried to piece it all together. I opened the other drawers, and they were the same, more chopped up body parts, more traces of me. My necklace was tangled in the mess. My watch, too. That's when the horrifying realization hit me. During my sleepwalking episodes, I must have been knocking on random apartment doors. And when the unsuspecting resident opened up, I must have attacked them. Their screams, they must have been the ones residents reported before people went missing. I'd stabbed them, cut them apart with my knife, and then wandered off with their limbs like some kind of twisted trophy. But what happened to the bodies? That's when another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Every apartment was in a blind spot, every single one of them. Whatever dark force haunted this building must have been taking the bodies, removing the evidence. It all started to make sense, even the night Faye disappeared. I must have nodded off when she went into the club room. In my sleep, I must have followed her, stabbed her, and left her to become one of them. Afterward, I must have gone to the cleaner's room, doused myself in chemicals to mask the blood, and wandered back to reception like nothing had happened. This building, this cursed place, it had been covering my tracks, hiding the evidence in its blind spots. No one would ever believe me, but I couldn't stay here any longer. I've decided to put in my notice and leave for good. The worst part? During my sleepwalking spells, I only seemed to target apartments with a single resident. People who lived alone. And even those screams must have echoed through the halls, no one ever came to help. Most people are too scared to act. And now, I'm one of the monsters they should have feared.